Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About the Deep Stuff. I'm your host, Sean Kneese. I hope you're all continuing to have a happy new year with new beginnings, and I hope you're still working on your New Year's resolutions, and hopefully it wasn't just a January resolution that you kind of fell off of. I know I've done that before, but today I wanted to talk about the universal language of music and how music can be a unifier of people with different cultures that can help break down boundaries. It's also been at the forefront of different social movements and political movements over the years, and has also been like kind of like a document of different times or different um, subcultures, like within different times. Like it kind of would document. It's a good document of like certain eras for like and I have a guest today, Ken Stevens, who's been around a while and he's been in different music scenes. I know you from like punk to Motown to hip hop. You've been to a lot of shows over the years, and I know you were in radio for a bit too. You mentioned, right? So why not? I'll let you kind of just like tell your story a bit, and then we'll kind of take it from there.
All right. Well, let me say first that I'm not a formally trained musician. I don't have a really formal musical education. I learned the basics, the elementals, when I received instrumental instruction in elementary school. I took woodwinds, clarinet in particular. So I learned the very fundamental elements of music, the scales, basic scale patterns, and basic chords. But most of my learning is self-taught, listening to radio and listening to records. And so my earliest interactive experiences performing with other musicians was with a few of my friends, childhood buddies. I guess we were maybe junior high school age at that point, maybe sixth or seventh grade. And we put together a little band. We had a guitarist, a bass player, drummer, myself. I had clarinet. By that point, I had purchased, by the 1973, I guess, I had purchased a soprano saxophone, which was my pride and joy. Unfortunately, I lost that. So I was playing soprano saxophone, and not long thereafter, we got another sax as a tenor, and then a trumpet player. So this is in the 70s, late middle 70s, when horn bands were popular. Chicago, pardon my smoking viewers, bands like Chicago, Earth, Wind and Fire, Kool and the Gang. These are some of the better known bands whose names might be easier to recall or more familiar with younger viewers or listeners. And so that was the model for our band, bands like that. So we listened to um, a lot of the classic, what was on the radio, black radio at the time. Marvin Gaye, James Brown, the whole Motown scene, George Clinton, the whole Parliament Funkadelic organization or unit was a very, very pervasive influence because they were local. You know, they were based in Newark and Plainfield, New Jersey. And so we were aware of that. And so we had a sort of a hometown kind of affinity for them. And which was easily supported by the fact that they were very good and, became very well liked worldwide. I mean, pretty, achieved some fairly pervasive level of influence and material success. So they were definitely a major model. So we're talking the mid 70s. By that time, everything that happened, the experience of the 1960s was still fairly fresh. So I think the culture was gradually moving, especially our age, because we were too young to be hippies. Some of our older siblings were old enough to be young hippies. And so we didn't really absorb that ethos. that 60s sort of rebellious and politically informed ethos so much. I mean, later on, we were exposed to music that conveyed that, like Gil Scott-Heron, people like that. And we found out about the black poets in groups that were really politically charged. But there was this movement in the 70s, by the mid 70s, toward, well, sometimes they refer to it as the me decade. And it was kind of a shift toward a kind of materialistic bent, mostly exemplified, and I don't mean to bash disco music, but it was associated with the disco phenomenon. Which, disco is mainly, excuse me, I won't call it necessarily hedonistic, but it wasn't noted for its like political consciousness, and that was reflected in our environment. There was a lot of there was less emphasis on quote unquote social awareness by that time, and more on, at least in the pop music world, more geared toward like escapism or fun, so to speak. So, but at the same time, you did have records, really groundbreaking records like Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On," which was which has become iconic for all of its various socio-political reverberations. So that that kind of sort of kept the spark of political consciousness alive. That, and I'm sure of many other records in the popular black music idiom at the time, albums like that. I'm sure there are others that I can't recall offhand, but that was a big one. So that current was still there. It wasn't all hedonism or escapism. So we played locally. We played in a number of local. There were a fair amount of live venues still left in the Newark area. Kind of clubs, smallish clubs with enough space to accommodate a little bandstand, and we played in a number of those. In fact, some of us were actually underaged at the time, but apparently,
okay.
but we were there nonetheless. So, well, I mean, we weren't allowed to drink, at least not openly, not in front of the the ownership or whatever. But we found our way. But we got a lot of experience performing live in front of audiences, and boy, that was a long time ago. But that's where I guess that was where my professional life began, because we were paid, however paltry the sum. So technically, that made it a professional engagement. But we had a lot of fun. We had more fun than earned money, but it was a learning experience being in a band and all of the day-to-day requirements for maintaining a performing band. And we didn't perform very often. I mean, if we performed once or twice a month, that was pretty good for us. But it was a very learning experience. That band performed until maybe 1976 or something like that. I guess I was fairly proficient at the time. I haven't played any of my instruments in quite a while now, but I was fairly proficient on the saxophone, and I did catch the attention of some other older musicians. One of whom was from East Orange, where I still live, and where I lived then. But his musical associates lived in Montclair, which is not very far from here from anybody's. And they were inclined to perform. They wanted to come up with original material, which was influenced by the jazz rock fusion kind of thing, which was happening at the time. And so jazz rock fusion, and still with an eye on what was happening in the R&B world. So that band was called Mosquito, which no one ever heard of. We didn't perform anywhere, but we did come up with some fairly ambitious stuff, And but we were a basement band, on all. Now this is by this time it's the 70s. It's the late 70s. In, I guess, the mainstream R&B and pop worlds by this point. This might be just a little before or after Saturday Night Live, which really propelled disco into the mainstream in a really big way. And but you have this jazz rock fusion thing, and your prog rock, progressive rock, which was, I don't know if it was it wasn't necessarily a reaction to disco, but it was a parallel movement which placed a great deal of influence on instrumental virtuosity and kind of complex arrangements, very often involving odd time signatures instead of your standard 4/4 beat, which runs through everything at whatever varying tempos. So you had that kind of parallel development, whereas disco was more direct. It was not as generally as compositionally um, intricate as your jazz rock, fusion, or progressive rock compositions. But sometimes it could be very lushly orchestrated with a lot of strings and all, and very musical. It wasn't. It was the emphasis in disco was on sophistication, not only in terms of one's like social interaction. There was this ideal of like elegance, and but also the music. At the beginning, it was much more basic and elementary or elemental. Then over time, it became much more elaborate and some might say overblown. So there was, even though it wasn't musically ambitious per se, but in terms of production, there was an attempt to, convey a very well manicured, well arranged, highly well produced, product, for lack of a better word. Of course, at the same time, you had the very early rumblings down in Lower Manhattan and up in the South Bronx and Upper Harlem to seedlings. Down in Lower Manhattan, you had the early rumblings and formation of what would become the punk rock scene and post-punk rock new wave. And of course, up in the South Bronx and Harlem, you had the early evolution or development of rap music, hip hop, you know. And in both those cases, there was an influence, particularly very early hip hop, very stripped down approach, very
They kind of they had a similar attitude in some ways. It was just from two different cultures, like the punk and
right.
the hip hop were both kind of like the same kind of idea. The DIY and criticize political, like criticizing the system, and kind of simplistic, but like making a statement.
Yeah,
But it
exactly.
was just two different approaches to that.
Two different approaches with the same kind of idea of a kind of direct and simple, not overly complicated. And you're right. It's a lot of early music, rap music, was very kind of party music oriented until, at least most notably, until Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five's The Message.
It wasn't the first that was like the revolution will not be televised. I forgot who
The
did that. That
Revolution
was
Will
like
Not Be Televised was
yeah.
um was the Black Poets. The
Oh, okay.
original creators of that was the Black Poets, who were very politically charged, like a Pan-African nationalistic, assembly of
Okay.
poets, and they did incorporate some musicians on their tracks, a lot of like percussion, but maybe occasionally a horn here, or maybe like a little rhythm section, maybe a drum kit and a bass and guitar, maybe a little keyboard. But right, definitely, the revolution will not be televised. Is one of their many sort of incisive kind of works. But they didn't. They were sort of a. They were kind of a precursor to rap music as it became known. Yeah, they kind of preceded that, but were certainly an influence on it. I don't think they. I'm pretty sure they did not have the reach as broadly encompassing a connection with the youth, and they were Harlem based, I'm pretty sure, as did the soon to emerge early rap artists. And a lot of that was just generational. They were older, you know, they were, you know, pretty much fairly well, probably adults by the late 60s. So by 1970, I guess the really earliest rap stuff was maybe 75. I'm not sure who
Like
actually.
Sugar Hill Gang, and you said Grandmaster.
Oh,
Was
right,
Sugar Hill Gang another
Sugar
one?
Hill
Yeah.
Gang.
Yeah.
Who else was really early? Then Cool Herc, who was really one of the earliest progenitors. And I don't really know a whole lot about him, uh, but I know he may have been the first one to have recorded one of his mixes and made it available to the public. I don't know if it was distributed by a major record label or if I think he circulated them himself. I think for but I don't know. The earliest rap record that I remember getting airplay is "These Are the Breaks" by Curtis Blow, which also had a kind of like the message. It had this kind of social consciousness. It was like an advisory. These are the breaks. Well, I guess it wasn't some a bit of an advisory as how to avoid some pitfalls, but it was certainly it was a litany of various pitfalls that might befall one if one is like an impoverished denizen of any one of America's large urban centers. So I wish I could remember the lyrics. I know in one case the protagonist is he borrows money from the mob. I mean he's in a bad case. But it was a dance record, very successful as a dance record, but it did have a bit of a social consciousness. Maybe not as heavy handed as the message, but it was
Yeah.
there. It wasn't just mindless party music, you know. There was a little bit of kind of lighthearted social commentary. But that's the
Yeah.
first one I
And what was
remember.
it when it was first coming out? What was it like when it was first coming out? Was it kind of like, oh wow, this is like really like direct and like real? It's like talking about real thing. What was it like for you seeing that stuff come out like for the first time, like hip hop and social conscious hip hop and
I think yeah, well I think I had the reaction that most people had in that particularly with those two tracks, like the message and the breaks by Curtis Blow, which and actually the breaks, if I'm not mistaken, the breaks I'm pretty sure preceded the message by a couple of years. But I think younger people, I think were engaged immediately, and they admired the kind of the element of braggadociousness, and there's a lot of kind of testosterone driven like posturing and the whole competitive thing with you know, DJs kind of putting one another down. You know what I mean? And mostly in a good natured way. You know, but I think that the culture of it attracted the people that were young enough that it spoke to directly. You know, I think people like myself by that point, I was actually young enough to fall fully under like rap's sway, except for the fact that I did play a musical instrument. So I remember one summer I had my father worked in Manhattan. He worked for the Department of Employment, so he wrangled me a summer job, and I was working for the what was the Morningside Heights Alliance, something like that. It was kind of a neighborhood meeting house and recreational center, and they would distribute wiffle balls and bats and basketballs, and we would take them to the housing project, which was not far away. This is it was on Amsterdam Avenue and 118th Street or something like that. And there was a large housing project not far away, up north on Amsterdam up to 125th Street. I think it was called Co-op City, but don't quote me. And we would take the sports stuff, and a lot of times maybe we would be lucky if we took half of it back. You know what I mean? Because the neighborhood kids, I guess they fell in love with it and had to have it. But what I observed on several occasions, but I was most taken aback the first time, was these kids. They had two turntables. Was they troubleshooted? They were plugged into the base of a public light, like a utility light. Not, I guess it's a street light, but this is within the borders of the housing project. So they're lighting, and I have no technical acumen whatsoever, but somehow they got they use that as a source of electricity, and they had their turntables and a couple of little speakers plugged into it, and or maybe two of those utility lights, and there was one little guy and he didn't even have a mic, and he was just doing this thing, rapping, and I was not I was taken aback, but in a good way. It wasn't it wasn't what the first thought that came to mind is how inventive and creative poor people can be when it comes to finding ways to entertain themselves or express themselves creatively. Rap. Well, I'll finish the main point. So there he was doing his rhyme, and it was very early, with phrases like "from a lime to a lemon, to a lemon to a lime." That was the line that would recur in different people's raps, But it's really old school, And there they were, and there were kids dancing around. They were doing these little dances that they were doing what was referred to as the worm, where you undulate on the ground on your stomach and move yourself forward. They were doing that, and they were doing other dances they were reminiscent of a dance called the robot. That
Or the is that the like this with the hands kind of?
Oh, exactly. And
Yeah.
we would see it on the popular television show called Soul Train that came on every weekend at the time. And the robot in the early what did they call it? There was another word for it. Locking, locking in. It was locking and breaking, but it was that was a Los Angeles. That was a Los Angeles. I'll just call it an invention, or for lack of a better word, or street dance, right? The locking. On Soul Train they had the locker dancers, locking, but I think they used the word breaking. The New York version was influenced by that because most young black kids probably watched Soul Train routinely. So it did have some influence on what became breakdancing in New York, in the hip hop culture. So what I saw these kids doing it looked like a combination of that kind of locker thing from Soul Train, and then early kind of the movements that later on would be clearly identified as like hip hop dance. Some kind of like break dance movements, but very early on, almost proto break dance, Now, and this was the summer of 1977, right? So I don't think by that time, I'm fairly certain someone out there might correct me. I don't think by that time any rap records had been played on any mainstream radio stations. In this case, it would be your R&B, soul, funk radio stations. And if I'm correct, the first one to achieve that distinction was "The Breaks" by Curtis Blow, and that was being played, and that was, I'm pretty sure, 1979, at least by the time it got played on the radio. I don't know when it was recorded and released. So by this point, by the summer of 77, rap music did not have any nationwide exposure that I'm aware of, you know, and it was brand new to me, you know. I was taken aback, but taken aback I was bemused, if that's the word, by the, I guess what we would call later the DIY-ness of it. You know what I mean? These poor black kids that had to craft a way to convey this like evolving like folk art form, which they would not use that language to describe. You know, a lot of rap music's genesis was the result of the inability of these young people to get into the clubs. If it was up to them, they would have gone to the clubs that were around that were playing disco at the time, you know, but they couldn't get into the
So it was
clubs.
like an alternative. They chose to do their own thing. Yeah.
Right, exactly. It was in large measure uh, 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 a response based on the fact that they were barred from getting into the disco, where the grown folks party. So they came up with an alternative that they could share in their basements or in the backyard or in a big um, empty lot, as long as there were some street lights nearby that they could troubleshoot. You know what I mean, and connect their turntables and speakers. I would see people do that also sometimes in Washington Square Park, way downtown in the village. So I don't know quite how it's done, but it seemed to be a fairly
How they originally did they took the records and then they kind of like they did a how did they do it originally?
the kids
Like
I
in the
saw.
early days, like making the beat and everything. Like
Right. Well, no, the kids I saw they had two turntables and two records, and he was alternating back and forth between two of them. He would like stop one and start the other one rhythmically. There wasn't a lot of turntable manipulation that I remember. I don't remember, there was no scratching, for example. It was just alternate, like the synchronized alternate, you know what I mean? And then he would take a change of one record and then kind of and mix it in with the other one, you know what I mean? And then sometimes again have two copies of the same record. But so that's basically what I saw. You know, that was the basic kind of pattern. Two records, the same record at the same time, being played alternately, and the one being stopped and the other started like rhythmically. And then the introduction of the next record, and you would have two records with the same, rhythmic alteration and like that. So, but again, I was bemused, and I was struck by what's that word? It's a very common word that's not going to ingenuity of like poor black kids. You know what I mean? That they found a way to they can't go to the club. They brought the club outside or to their basements, or you know what I mean. But I did have there was a little bit of an air of superiority in my attitude. You know, it was kind of like the benign superiority, but it was there nonetheless because I played a musical instrument and they
okay,
did not. You know what I mean? And so what they were doing was pure. Even I don't think I had the term folk art at my disposal. but that's how I viewed it. You know what I mean? That's something that's very uh, raw and unrefined. You know what I mean? But very inventive. You know, this
Yeah,
is before I had no idea what was coming. You know what I mean? And I at the time I
you
didn't
didn't know it
even
was gonna be like this whole movement.
right. I thought it was, and I thought it was limited to over there because there was nothing like it in Jersey, even in Newark. And Newark was a very, as urban, a large northeastern urban city with all of the elements that might inspire a record like The Message. In terms of dystopian
So,
element. It wasn't
so
all
I guess
that.
that wasn't till later there would be like bands like the Roots, because I know like the Roots they use like instruments. They use like the rap group the Roots, like they have like actual bass player drum, like
Oh, right
I don't
now.
know. Yeah,
Right. Yeah. Right. The Roots were. I think they were. Yeah. I guess they were innovators in that respect, and to have like a fully, a full band with a rhythm section, bass, drums, guitar, and keyboards, etc. Right. Prior to that, I think you would see maybe some hip hop outfits might incorporate a horn player, and I can't even think of an example. I mean, and sometimes on their records you would hear horns, and then those were very often samples. But I can't think of a hip hop, a rap unit that incorporated a whole band or even any real instruments live. That example might just be escaping me now. Um, I know later on a Tribe Called Quest, by the '90s, where they used Ron Carter, who's this really a kind of classic jazz bass player. They used him on the track on the record. I don't think he went out on the road with him. I don't think they had a live bass player, especially an upright bass player, on the stage with him. But you know what? I can't say with exact surety, with 100% surety, that the Roots are the first rap band
yeah. I
to.
was just wondering if like there were ones like that like earlier on that I didn't
There
know.
may,
Yeah,
I don't.
yeah,
I can't think of any. They may have been.
yeah.
They may have been. It
But I
would
guess
kind of.
overall the main thing, it was a way for people to be heard that weren't usually heard, and did it helped them be heard? People
It
that
helped them.
wouldn't usually be heard. I guess.
Right. It helped them be heard, even if at the beginning they were happy enough just to be heard in their neighborhood and on the local circuit as it evolved, and these different individuals became proficient, and then they had more and more of their sort of DIY venues to utilize. Um,
And I guess punk kind of came out around the same time in a different culture, like in the like
Downtown.
working class UK, like or in the yeah.
But there's another element to hip hop, and this maybe more ties into uh, the social relevant element that we had hoped to identify. And I didn't want to lean heavily on like quote unquote social consciousness in some kind of like didactic, preachy, fired up way, you know, because that's not my personal disposition. Though I'm often fired up by socio-political intrigue and malfeasance. But
But I guess like punk, like in like a different culture, I guess like more like that was kind of like a similar statement for like I guess like other like bands that couldn't like
well, they had
it was
right.
simple,
They
yeah.
they had a similar degree of limited access to like mainstream rock clubs. But what I wanted to finish about hip hop is because this is an important element, and then I will move to like the downtown rock scene. Was early on, early on, it was the whole idea of it initially, or at least it may have started or like autonomously in among the kids without much adult oversight or supervision. But at some point, someone, maybe one of the kids themselves, or maybe somebody old enough to be a big brother, saw that this rap music could be used as a vehicle to kind of move the kids away in that area, away from what was a pretty virulent gang culture in New York in the 70s. The old gangs that wore the denim cutoffs and they had the colors, Savage Skulls. There were a lot of them. The Savage Skulls come to mind because they were they were notorious. But there were a lot of them. I wish I could remember some more of them. But these were your 1970s gangs. The gangs of the type that film The Warrior was kind of a fanciful kind of depiction of. That was a big movie in the Warriors. But those kind of gangs were pretty prominent, and they did recruit a lot of kids, into their ranks for the same reason that kids are attracted to gangs in in their oppressed, suppressed, repressed, poor urban environment in the hood, for whatever the various reasons were. But those gangs were very prominent at the time, and they were very active, and they were a source of a lot of fear in the communities that they were headquartered in, and they would go elsewhere and terrorize people, you know, and even have their little conflicts in neutral territories, their little bad wars. So someone decided that rap music could be used as a way to transform that competitive rivalry, that territorial rivalry thing, which also incorporated, drug selling, criminality, and a lot of drug dealing
So
and
I thought it could turn people away from that, like, and take
to
a different
turn
path.
people away from that, so that they could have their battles that way. Breakdancing, and that was
Is that where rap battling comes from? Is that like where
that's where
rap
it
battling
comes.
comes from?
That way, right? It was the intention was to and again, there was some adult interference here at some point. You know what I mean? The local community workers, social workers that were still young enough to connect with kids. And I don't know who these people were, you know, who came up with the idea and who kind of engineered it and 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 used the early rap culture to kind of lure kids away from the pull of the gangs. But that was a large part of its early impetus. And so there was its origins had much to do with the frustrated local youth who were not old enough to get into the clubs and who had to invent their own version of that. You know what I mean? But at the same time, whatever personages in the community that saw the potential of this emerging rap culture as a way to draw kids away from the gang culture as an alternative to it, you know. So don't fight with your guns and your knives. Fight with your moves, with your break moves.
Well, then that's interesting that later on some rap music would then kind of be all about the like the gains, like lyrically, like certain rap, not all. There's all different kinds of rap, but like yeah,
Right.
yeah.
All these various subgenres have emerged. So, right, and what became gangster rap, mostly identified with Los Angeles, Southern California, Compton, and what do they call it? And Los Angeles back in the day, the hood was uh, was Watts, right? And I forget what part. I don't know if that's west or south. I think it's South Los Angeles. I know East LA has traditionally been a large Mexican American community, part of the city. But they don't use the term Watts. They use goodness gracious. It's very common for the part of Los Angeles where most of the black folks live. But damn if I can't. South Central. South Central is Watts, but Watts was the nomenclature, was the little identifier, the local identifier name then, Watts. But somehow South Central became more popular. But so a lot of the early gangster rap, which kind of glamorized, the gang life, your bitch hole inward rap music, which is how some people, summarize it at the time, and which was largely identified with the whole greater Los Angeles rap and gang culture. So there were some elements like that in the New York form version, even prior to the ascendancy of gangster rap, which came to be the dominant subgenre for a while there. But there were rap outfits which would make allusions to kind of criminal gang activity, but not organized on such a grand scale as were the Crips and Bloods. They were huge. They had huge numbers, and their membership went back to like the 1960s. There were people that were in their 40s in the 1980s that were Crip members. What I'm talking about in New York were more your little like posses. You know what I mean? But like little criminal posses. Your little drug dealing networks that they had whatever their reach was. They were in constantly in competition for territory and customers, and they would have these conflagrations that would in incorporate the gunplay, but they were not like, again, they were not organized on the scale of the Bloods or Crips, but it would leak out. It would come out in some of the music. I'm trying to remember this guy's name. He was very good. Um, his music would kind of delineate some of that. You know what I mean? Boy, I wish I could remember. He was good too, and he had a grill. He had like a gold grill, kind of fairly early on. By the mid, this was maybe 1980. That the earliest maybe 84, maybe more like 85, 86. But he had a full on grid, like his teeth, at a time when you didn't see that frequently then. You saw some people had it. Oh boy, I can't remember his name. Uh the track was Roads to the Riches. Roads to the Riches. His name is gonna come back to me hours later on. Probably. I can't remember it now. But he was kind of gangster rap, the New York based gangster rap, you know what I mean? And his stories would involve these little conflicts with like these little drug kingpins. There were a bunch of kingpins at the time. They were kingpins on their scale, you know, in their pond. But a lot of well, maybe I don't know a lot because I didn't purchase his records. But what I remembered hearing did chronicle that world. You know what I mean? And there was lots of reference to gunplay and N words and hoes, what have you. But so that was a precursor to what you're referring to, is the gangster rap that really kind of came to dominate by I guess like the mid to late 90s. Right?
Yeah.
In the earlier part of the 90s and the late 80s, and I'm stuck on hip hop here. I'm going to get back to what was happening downtown in its similar genesis. But there was, by the late 80s and early 90s in rap music, there was this emergence of what they called, it also had a very kind of a, they came up with consciousness rap, I guess, you know, which it could be looked at as an extension of like The Message, which came out, and The Message was out in maybe 1983. So by 1986, 7, you started getting this consciousness rap, which was geared more toward like social Pan-Africanism and Black political consciousness regarding African American history and the principal figures therein. And so you had bands like Public Enemy is the most obvious example, but there were a couple before them, like the
Okay.
Jungle Brothers, and even Pete Rock and CL Smooth come to mind.
But
And
it was KRS-One's one I like. I don't know
yeah,
how.
good. I could not right. He's
Yeah, yeah,
really one of the main early ones. He
yeah,
right, maybe the main early one. He preceded Public Enemy, too. He was out before Public.
yeah,
Like KRS One and even and the Jungle Brothers, who were not so who didn't really get so much mainstream acceptance or recognition as some of their peers, like Tribe Called Quest, were kind of on the same kind of circuit as like the Jungle Brothers.
yeah. And then they became pretty known, right? The Tribe Called Quest.
Tribe Called Quest, right? They just became more prominent.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and KRS is still doing his thing. He's still recording records and doing his thing.
I believe he is. I believe he is.
Yeah,
I wouldn't doubt. I wouldn't doubt
yeah,
that he is. Another prime mover, as far as another one of the people that helped with that transition with trying to like move the youth away from gang culture to like the emerging hip hop culture was, and I have to mention him because he was very significant. I mean, you mentioned Sugar Hill Gang, and who were produced by Sylvia Robinson, and I won't get into her now. But oh my goodness, Soul Sonic for Africa Bambaataa. Oh my goodness, Africa Bambaataa. From what I understand, he was one of the early drivers of this move, of this attempt to help the local youth to avoid the pitfalls of gang life. And because I think that he himself was in one of those gangs and got out before he died, you know what I mean, before the lifestyle killed him. Africa Mabata, who's another interesting figure. But yeah, and as I recall, he was an integral member of whatever the team or confluence of individuals that sought to, seize upon this opportunity to draw kids away from the gang culture. He was one of them, at least. African Bambaataa. Do you remember him?
I don't know. I never heard of his stuff, but
Right, and he's really early.
yeah,
Soul Sonic Force. They wore a lot of like elaborate costumes. It seemed to me, and I think it was pretty obvious that they were at least visually they were very much influenced by the Parliament Funkadelic thing, because Parliament Funkadelic wore a lot of outrageous, like weird stage apparel, and with African Bambaataa, I guess yeah, Soul Sonic Force, they wore very similar stuff, lots of hoods and big, large, oversized shades and robes and some shiny material, and you know what I mean. And but there were no bands, there were no instruments on the stage. There were just like drum machines and the early like sequences and what have you, and which they had a very distinctive sound. I think maybe they even called it like electro funk or something like that. But their earliest hit, or I might be misassociating African Bombata with
yeah. The
futurist
German,
kind of
yeah,
right.
future, yeah.
And their big hit was Trans Europe Express. You remember that one? You're kind of young for that one.
No, I don't remember. I don't remember like the specific song, but I know
Right. Well,
Kraftwerk. Yeah, like the electronic group. I
right,
heard them a while ago, but I don't remember.
right.
Yeah.
Trans Music Express was their big hit. Um, and I think they got played on what was FM rock radio at the time, where they were an odd fit at the time because this, what was being played on mainstream FM rock, album rock, was a lot of long haired, like guitar driven hard rock stuff. And they didn't fit into that at all. Um, but they did fit into, actually, their records found their way to the disco culture. Right. That's where they got, that record really got most of its, where it was most broadly received, not in the rock community. And in disco, of course, being very popular in the African American community, among many others, but, you know, formatively in the African American and Latino community, and very quickly spread to other communities in New York and the world. So disco was adjacent to the different genres that were popular in the urban or African American or whatever community at the time. So the kids that were some of the kids that were listening to early rap music or helping to create it, heard that record, Trans Europe Express, and it had a driving funky beat, and it was very quickly. It was a big hit on black radio, Trans Music Express, and so it made sense that it was early, very early on adopted as a sampling source. Very early, very popular. Maybe as early as James Brown, because that record came out in 1976, so its timing was good. And even though it incorporated, it was all electronic and synthesizers and stuff, it still had a very elemental quality. It sounded pretty spare and straight ahead. It wasn't ornate, you know what I mean? And and it did not display a lot of musical virtuosity like what was happening in the jazz rock fusion. Well, somehow
But all that
we were
but all that
briefly.
kind of came out of a similar. Oh, I added. I was just gonna say like because I know like blues and jazz and everything. It all came out of because like you mentioned before, like the impoverished kids in urban communities like want to be heard. But I know like also like blues and jazz and that came out of that too, right? Like those harder times, like
uh yeah,
yeah.
yeah, a lot of well certainly like well we know the blues, the early blues experience was a cultural outgrowth of what was happening in the South, and we're all familiar with that, the whole slavery and post-slavery experience, and there was a desire, as there was a general desire emerged among the African American population to move northward. The great, it'll come back to me. It's a very another common term that is applied to that time period. First, around World War I, the Great Migration of African Americans from the mostly rural South and even the urban South to the northern cities, Chicago, New York, etc. And so there was a parallel to the need and desire to move to those cities to achieve a better quality of life and to escape, very overt and often violent racism. There was also the desire of some of the early bluesmen to move to those cities for that same reason and to have access to a more immediate audience in a city that could get to a club. They knew there were cities with nightclubs. They just could not. There was no. There was not much in the way of a demand for blues music and nightclubs yet. I don't know. I guess at that time, maybe by that time, maybe there were clubs for early jazz. The early jazz culture.
Well, even in a
I
sense,
think
rock
so.
and roll came from the African American community with like Chuck Berry, and Elvis was kind of used to sell that sound, but it was like originally was it from the African American community with like
Oh,
Chuck Berry.
no, no,
Yeah,
definitely, definitely. And that music was an outgrowth of the blues, obviously. Blues with a up backbeat, more up tempo backbeat, and different kind of concerns. Um, yeah, because it was a younger person's adaptation of the blues.
yeah. Like a simpler, like back to bit. Well, I guess blues is kind of has a simple thing to it too, right? Because it just uses like the well, jazz was more about the about the more complex.
More complex
Yeah,
instrumental
yeah,
applications, and more complex, like harmonically, and in terms of chord progression. Um, Whereas blues is based on that 12 bar pattern, which which I can't describe in any technical way, but you can hear it. It's very
yeah. Well, the
repetitive.
blues scale, right?
But
Just like the blues scale. Yeah,
the blues scale, and the progression is this the same. It's the 12 bar blues progression is it's static, but even though you can do a lot in it, but it is maybe static sounds pejorative, but it is fixed. So you work within that progression. If you're playing the blues, you're playing that 12 bar cycle. You know what I mean? Even though some people might vary it a little bit, they might extrapolate it. But the traditional blues pattern is that 12 bar cycle. You can play it very slowly. You can play it in a very up tempo way. You can arrange it in any number of ways and still be adhering to that chord progressive pattern. Yeah. Yep. So blues moved to the big cities for the same reason that the African American population at large moved there in general, and that did make it more accessible to people that did not grow up in the South and that had immediate access to it just in their communities. They became they were came to the attention of whatever little record companies that were around that catered to the African American audience. And I'm sure those little record companies saw dollar signs. We can get these people on record and get these records distributed. You move them up from just playing like the local Chitlin circuit or what have you, places that they may have been playing in the South, or even the places in the city, in the various cities that they moved to, but still very few people were being recorded. So you're in creative types that had some ingenuity saw an opportunity to entertain their entrepreneurial ambitions, and at the same time, at least bring some greater visibility to these artists, and maybe they might make a buck or two here and there. You know, Not a whole lot of money involved, I would imagine, in the early days. So, I mean, we we have touched on some of the parallels, which the kind of socio-political
yeah.
parallel.
But I know you also went to what I thought was it because I remember you told me that you also like you were familiar with like the Velvet Underground, like you went to some of the punk shows at one point, right? Or
I
you saw
did.
some of the
I
early.
did. I did.
Yeah,
I'm lingering on rap music because when you first proposed this conversation, I was it was not easy for me to um, delineate the evolution of some of these musics, especially particularly rap, to a kind of what you might call a social agenda or some relevance to the social firmament of the time, the surrounding social firmament. But then some occurred to me, such as the whole thing with the gangs. and what have you, and the emerging the gang culture and luring the youth away from that, and I'm going to get to what was happening downtown, because what was happening downtown was what was happening citywide in New York City at the time, because New York City was in the midst of a huge fiscal crisis, and which was brought to the attention of much of the rest of the United States, if they were not aware of New York's economic woes, when New York asked for a loan, some federal assistance, and the president at the time, Gerald Ford, his very famous reaction was "drop dead," is what he quite literally said
So
to the city fathers of New York who were asking for some dough for assistance.
it's
And
kind of like the let them eat cake, similar
kind
to the
of
let
right.
them eat
Well, yeah,
cake.
even worse than
Yeah,
let them get it, kind of right.
yeah.
So of course, so that affected the economy of the city and citywide. And of course, typically when a city has an economic downturn, then the parts of the city that are going to be most affected are the parts of the city that were already in an economic downturn, and that would be your urban ghettos or slums. You know, your the parts of the city that were already economically deprived became even more so, and that was true of the South Bronx, and the South Bronx epitomized it more than any other part of the city. You know, um, and Harlem. Um, Boy, I'm coming up with these ancillary things because I'm going to get downtown. I'm going to get downtown. But what's these things that are some of the things that are occurring to me now speak to a parity between what was happening uptown and what was happening downtown. But one thing I forgot to say: the South Bronx, the whole hip hop is identified as having sprung from cracks in the pavement in the South Bronx in North Harlem. But there's a third wheel. There's a third wheel, which is often overlooked in terms of locale. And that third wheel is Englewood, New Jersey, right across the river, which is where Sylvia Robinson lived. Sylvia Robinson is a woman who produced the Sugar Hill Gang. She was their progenitor and their wow. You have boy, what do you call that relationship? You have the person who is the shucks. I hate when these common terms evade me. You have an apprentice, and you have who is the person that overlooks the apprentice?
I don't know, like a supervisor. I don't know.
No, it's not. That's not the word. But she was like their apprentice, and their manager, and their cultivator, and she produced a record. But the thing about I also wanted to say, Englewood, New Jersey. Englewood, New Jersey has long had an African American community, which has long, because Englewood has very immediate access to Harlem in the South Bronx. And for decades, black people in Englewood went to Harlem in the South Bronx, and to some degree, I would imagine, the reverse was true. Englewood, a lot of those kids, those early progenitors of rap, a lot of those kids that were putting rap together were black and maybe Latino kids also from Englewood who had friends in the Bronx and Harlem who went back and forth regularly. That was a regular kind of exchange. You know what I mean? It was probably more Englewood to Harlem because that's where all the action was. But I'm sure those kids over in the Harlem and the Bronx had friends in Englewood. They probably went visited them, went to their homes, and vice versa. Englewood the is the overlooked third wheel in terms of locales when it comes to the evolution of what would become rap music and hip hop culture. A lot of those early progenitors were kids from Englewood who just hung out in Harlem a lot of the time, you know? So that's kind of it's not really a gripe, but it is something that and it's not even doesn't rise to the level of a thorn in my side because I'm not that invested in it, but it is it is overlooked. It's an oft overlooked and broadly overlooked fact that there was this community of African American people that for decades would go into Harlem to go to the jazz clubs back in the 30s and 40s. And whatever was going on in Harlem, they would go to Harlem to do that because they would have to just go across the George Washington Bridge. They was a very quick sojourn. You know what I mean? And those kids there were equally as impressed upon by these early rumblings, you know, of what would become rap music and hip hop culture. So, so I think I covered as much as I can with regard to hip hop culture and its social, reverberations. You know what I mean? So we get
Yeah.
downtown, as you mentioned, Lower East Side, and the kind of and the Lower West Side, but Lower East Side driven. But a lot of the those punk bands, a lot of their reach extended over to like Third Avenue, which I guess Third Avenue is technically anything east of Fifth Avenue is the East Side, I guess. But Third Avenue is the western end of St. Mark's Place, which is 8th Street, really. St. Mark's Place is 8th Street East. But in St. Mark's Place starts at it becomes referred to as St. Mark's Place at I think at Third Avenue, which is technically the East Side, but it's the western end of the East Village. So right, you had now I was not privy, I did not have an immediate early exposure to early what would become punk the way I did with hip hop. When I was working for the Morningside Area Alliance, and I was taking wiffle bats and basketballs in the cart up to that housing project where I saw these kids with their troubleshooted turntables and little dinky little and their little speakers. You know what I mean? However, they had them jacked up to that street lamp. Basically, it was a street lamp, but so I didn't have an analogous experience to that. I didn't stumble into some little rock club downtown in Lower Manhattan and hear this like stripped down kind of stuff. See some band of like locals kids that didn't look like what mainstream rock bands looked like, at the time. I didn't have that person. I came to it later on, you know what I mean? I found out about it from the radio like everybody else. But I did make my way to CBGB's fairly early. I was in 1977. I made my way to CBGB's. But the thing about the New York punk scene that I think was kind of overlooked was that it had a similar socioeconomic crisis as did the English version, which would be extrapolated from the New York version, no doubt, but which evolved into its own animal, English punk. But a lot of theirs was driven by what was happening in England at the time England at large, when they were experiencing the huge, and in simple terms, just a huge economic downturn, which resulted in the numbers of English citizens seeking public assistance, their version of welfare, which they refer to as the dole, to very large numbers.
Yeah.
Well,
And it was kind of their working class pride too, right? Like in the British scene, that's what I
the
got from it,
British
like their
punk,
working class pride,
right,
or English punk, like the early English punk. Yeah,
that they were like proud to be on the dole.
like the proud, like working, like the it was kind of like pride in like the working class roots, kind of.
Well, definitely proud of their
Yeah,
working
yeah,
class roots,
yeah.
and and um, and not ashamed of being on the dole because so many people were. But the New York punk thing had a similar, there was a similar element of financial deprivation because New York was having, the United States probably wasn't in the best shape so economically at that time in the mid 70s, but certainly in New York there was this New York centric or New York housed, for lack of a better term. Boy, I'm really calling at a loss for some really basic terminology today, but which was New York, I won't say confined, but New York based, a New York based economic crisis, which was maybe even, well, at least parallel to the what was happening in England, and which provided us a similar social circumstance for the New York punks. They were living in a culture which was experiencing an economic downturn at the time. But that element is more emphasized when it comes to the English punks, the whole English, whatever was going on, and the dole culture. But there was something like that already happening in New York. New York was having its version of that, you know. So, which I think is not often referred to when people think back to the early beginnings of what would become punk rock. But
Yeah, and there was two different kinds of sounds too. I guess like the UK and the New York. Yeah,
right, I guess like the New York, a lot of the early punk, the British bands were much more aggressive and hard rock edged than say a band like the early Talking Heads, which they Talking Heads weren't really a punk band per se. They were minimalist, but they were more kind of an art band, you know, like a very stripped down kind of a art rock band. But they had some of the same basic principles in common with a band like the Ramones. But the Ramones were more like a punk band, the kind of punk band that the English bands modeled themselves after. You know, loud and, guitar driven, but loud and dynamic and like with rapid tempos, and even other
and
bands.
like the simple back to basics too, like
And
the
back to basics, stripped
simple. Yeah,
down chord structure, right? No, no, because they were also a reaction to the pompous and overly ornate and even kind of like even snobby element that a lot of this kind of snobby element of instrumental virtuosity that you found
yeah,
in what was happening in prog rock and in progressive jazz. This influence on instrumental virtuosity that was delivered from this kind of superior attitude, the way these, very trained musicians
yeah. I
kind
think
of.
they even said that to like Pink Floyd, right? Like they were kind of even irritated with like Pink Floyd. It was kind of like a fu to even like Pink Floyd.
Right,
That
right.
kind of
Even though,
yeah,
right, Pink Floyd didn't. A lot of Pink Floyd's music was very fairly basic, but they had
yeah,
they hated like hippie attitude. You know what I mean? Like take a lot of psychedelics and disengage
yeah.
from the world, and also
Well, I feel like hippies was kind of like, oh, let's all sit in peace and love, and like punk's like, oh, let's actually do something about it. And hip hop too, like the conscious hip hop was kind of like, let's actually do something about it. And like the hippie music was more just like, oh, let's all do drugs and like psychedelics, and we'll solve the world that way instead of like actually doing something. And punk
right
was more like hands on, like
more hands-on. Well, some of the hippies, some of the early hippies were they would get like let get stoned and then go and go and
yeah,
participate in a demonstration. You had like
yeah.
your hate.
Well, I mean, there was drugs in the punk and the hip hop too, of course, but like, I mean, like as far as like it was more like direct action. Like I guess like
it
is
was
what I'm
it was
saying. Like it seems like
it was more direct action, but also the psychedelic culture itself became more apolitical by the 70s. So where a lot of times they would take acid and that would fuel their desire to go participate in a demonstration and maybe even get billy clubbed by the police. You know, by the 70s, it had morphed into this more kind of like navel gazing thing. You know what I mean? You get all tripped out and just watch the wallpaper, the pattern on the wallpaper
Yeah,
move around. It became more um,
yeah,
kind of a self-contained pursuit of a sensual alteration. You know what I mean?
yeah. Which probably is. I guess that's just a result of those like the psychedelic substances, because then you're just kind of one with everything. Then it's not.
Well, it was
You're not really
it
like.
it, it was that, but it also it dovetailed with this move toward narcissism, which many people say the 70s was marked by. The 60s had been referred to as the we decade. The 70s was being referred to as the me decade. And that was maybe most exemplified by the disco because it was very indulgent and it aspired to glamour and material excess and affluence. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But
When a lot of the hippies ended up selling out too, I understand. Like they ended up being like Wall Street
well, you're right.
guys and
Well,
stuff. So, so
a lot of them
yeah,
sold out, but a lot of them moved into a more kind of narcissistic kind of perspective. So I mean, it's like I said, they would still trip, but tripping would be combined with listening to music or maybe watching odd films, things that the focus was more on sensual stimulations and consciousness alteration, but it didn't have a lot of the it lost some of the underlying political consciousness that the people that were tripping in 1968 and 7 had. By 1975, 3, 4, people were still taking acid and stuff. And
like people forgot what the original reason was. I guess right. Like
right, or much of the social
yeah,
impetus was not
yeah. Because in the '60s there was a civil rights
there
movement.
was a
That was like the that
movement
was
to
like
connect
yeah,
it with. There was the student
yeah,
protest movement. You know what I mean? And those things were
yeah.
ongoing. Those
And then there was the Vietnam War too. The
and the Vietnam
Vietnam
War.
War.
And by the early 70s, those things were still ongoing, but the younger people that might have been drawn to participate to those political activities, socio-political activities, people who were maybe 17 or 18 in 1968 or 69 were more inclined maybe to be galvanized and mobilized by those things than people who were 17 or 18 in 1973. You know what I mean? By 1973, and maybe in more general terms, a 17 or 18-year-old would be less inclined to be drawn to direct political action. They might
Because there
be
wasn't as much going on. You mean or yeah?
uh, not as much going on, or there was a generational divide that was in progress. You know, so a lot of the kids who were 17 in 1973 were only let's see, if somebody was 17 in 1968, that's a 5-year difference. So somebody who's 17 in 1968, what, 5 years later is 1973. So if that person who is 17 in 1968, this is basic math. I'll get to it momentarily. The person who is 17 in 1973 is only 5 years younger than the person who was 17 in 1968. But that 5-year gap is kind of significant. By 1973, the civil rights movement and the student protest movement, the anti-war movement, and what by 1973 now you had the gay rights had emerged, and whatever else I overlooked. But feminism, anti-war, civil rights, all still ongoing, but somehow I think less likely to galvanize and mobilize that the 17-year-old in 1973 than the 17-year-old in 19, as opposed to the one who was 17-year-old in 1968. That's that 5-year difference, I think, accounts for a different reaction on the part of the 17-year-old person in 1973. And this is very loose, you know what I mean? And not based on any kind of demographic insight or anything. But I think in very general terms, that was the case. The kid who wanted to trip by 1973, because I remember that's when I started taking the hallucinogens when they were introduced to me. and our interest in them was purely for since none of us expounded, it did not enhance our political consciousness in the least, and that's not what the intent of it was. The intent of our use. It was purely for sensual stimulation, to watch colors trail and people's faces melt on TV or whatever it was. You know what I mean? Which kind of is aligned with this notion of this emerging 1970s narcissism. Largely referred to with the disco kind of, for the most part, being kind of referred to as the most exemplary of that. But if you look at punk rock, it was kind of narcissistic, but in a nihilistic way. You know what I mean? I have no future. The world is dark. There's very little way of a future opportunity for me. So I am going to pursue this nihilistic lifestyle. I'm going to express my distress and my singular behavior, which is mirrored by my peers, but we're all driven by our kind of a self-concern, maybe. At least it depends on what kind of punk you are. That might be true of a Sex Pistols kind of punk,
Yeah.
but much less
But
true
then
of
later on,
the Clash.
like I think or like early '80s, the hardcore bands, there was like Minor Threat was straight edge punk. Like there were different people who did different punk in different way. Yeah,
Right, but even
yeah,
before them, you had the Sex Pistols, who were kind of more nihilistic, and then you had the Clash, who emerged not much later. They were really around the same time. The Clash came out of the box with this kind of politicized view. You know what I mean? So it was there from the beginning. It was there and even the Sex Pistols, it was more implicitly political, but they were more broadly. The Sex Pistols, I think, intended themselves to be this kind of like outsized expression of disaffection and frustration, as exemplified, which was part and parcel of being um, working class and poor and jobless in the England of the early and up to maybe in the 1970s in general. But it was just more. I think it expressed more kind of like the Sex Pistols in particular, and bands like them. More of just this kind of a display of anger and outrage meant to upset the sensibilities of the quote unquote establishment and maybe even frighten some people. But it didn't attach itself to any political kind of agenda. It was just more to like scare the shit out of you and outrage your sensibilities. You know what I mean? And disturb you. but not necessarily to move you in the direction of any political
Yeah.
enlightenment.
I guess unless it's like there's a band Crass that was like the start of anarcho punk, which was more like the more like directly political.
Right, right. Yeah, bands like
Yeah,
that. And I picked the Clash because the Clash had a high degree of visibility, where bands like the Crash were much less known. I remembered that name.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah.
so then, of course, the Clash were not alone, and neither were the Sex Pistols. But I think maybe you had a kind of a dichotomy, and maybe there was a trichotomy, but you definitely had that dichotomy in the British punk thing. Some of them were a lot more politicized, and others seemed just to be more just like displays of nihilistic outrage. I'm outraged. I'm gonna destroy myself more than my
So
reaction.
like just being self-destructive rather than
Right,
like
right,
trying to make some kind of
right,
yeah.
right. My response to these social deprivations and social political deprivations will be reflected in my nihilistic and self-destructive behaviors. I will not, as opposed to an aggressive outward action toward some social institution which might represent or me be complicit in my oppression. You know, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to shoot dope and get drunk and go to a
Yeah,
club and gob on my friends. You know,
yeah. But
so,
that's interesting because I think I bet like the Minor Threat. I don't know if you heard of them. They came like yeah. They started the whole like straight. They started like the whole other direction, like the straight edge
right, right,
punk movement. Yeah,
right. They, and I would imagine they very much disapproved of that nihilistic punk that wanted to shoot dope and get drunk and and die young and stay pretty. Right. No, no, they were
yeah,
reacting to that, even though they looked just like those other guys. I mean, with their mohawk and their gear, you know what I mean, the way they in their skateboards and what have you.
yeah,
But right, straight edge, right, which is a very interesting reaction to I guess a healthy reaction to
yeah. Because I guess it was kind of like there's other people who maybe they want to be a part of a subculture. They don't want to necessarily conform to the mainstream, but there's different ways to do that. There's not one way to be like an individual, or not one. I don't think there's one right way to be punk. And I think if somebody's talking all about like, oh, you got to be this way to be rebellious, or you got to be this way to be an individual, then that person's just like they'll call other people posers, but I think that person's the poser because they think they need to follow like some kind of
some kind of
trend to be. Yeah,
a paradigm. They have to
yeah,
make sure
and
they
like
are
fit some kind of image, like too.
right. They have to make sure
Yeah,
that they are somehow signifying the right markers at all times. You know what I mean? So I'm a real punk. You know. So
yeah.
and in order to be a real punk, I got to take drugs.
Do this.
Right.
Yeah,
Take speed or whatever the
yeah.
drug of choice is. You know.
Yeah, I think there was I saw this cartoon. It was like all these guys in mohawks, and there was this one guy in a suit. He was the one dressing different, and then they're all pointing at him. Ha ha! You conformist, and they're the one.
Oh, because
So
he was the conformist was the one taking drugs.
yeah, like well, they were all they all had like the same look, like with the mohawks and
Right.
everything. And then one guy in a business suit shows up, and then they're like,
Oh,
"Oh, ha ha! Look,
oh,
he's a
right, right, right,
conformist."
right, right. Got it. Yeah, right, right, right. You conformist, right. Well, there you go. There you go. And then that speaks to the tribalization that happens, with some,
Yeah,
like even in punk, certain punks had a certain look, they wore certain signifiers, I would imagine that, so they could distinguish
yeah.
themselves from the other punks.
Yeah,
But
and then
there
there
would
was
be,
one I like, Jello Biafra, like the Dead Kennedys, because
right, right.
they really like kind of did their own thing. Like I liked how there were people within the punk movement that were just made it about like being yourself, like or like thinking for
Right,
yourself. And I feel like KRS-One kind of did that with hip hop. Like he didn't follow like the trends and stuff. He just kind of was him, KRS-One.
right.
Yeah,
I think he was a reaction. KRS-One kind of had what Africa Bambaataa had in mind, and trying to move hip hop away from gangs and criminality, the little drug posses and all, you know. And part of that was Part of that might have been due to the fact that his original DJ was shot.
Hmm.
His
Who,
first,
KRS's or the other?
right, the first DJ, his first DJ accompanist, whose name I can't recall, was shot.
Was he the one that was with him in BDP or Boogie Down Production? Yeah.
An early BDP, yes. I can't remember his name and what the circumstances were, but he may have been it may have been ancillary to some kind of criminal activity, or maybe he was more directly directly involved. I can't recall, but I think that provided some of KRS's one's impetus to move hip hop away from like criminality, and more toward black consciousness. I mean, he had that personal experience where he lost a friend.
Yeah.
Boy, I wish I could remember
Yeah,
his
I
name.
think he mentioned that in like one of his songs. Scott or something was his name, I think.
Yeah,
He said he was killed.
Scott LaRock.
Yeah,
Scott
yeah,
LaRock. That was him.
yeah.
DJ Scott LaRock. He replaced him with DJ, I want to say Easy E, but that might be his name.
Easy E, I thought he was like with Dr. Dre, that scene, right? Like Dr. Dre.
Well, I think I'm confusing. Yeah, I'm confusing the names. The other
Yeah.
one had an E in his name. This is very unsightly, me smoking a cigarette down to the root. Pardon me.
But how did you like CBG? Like, how did you end up going to CBGBs and like branching out to like all those other like music scenes? Was it just curiosity about what was going on, or?
Well, it was curiosity. Was curiosity. Um, for a time there, I don't mention this very often because my time there was not was largely wasted. But I did. I went to Columbia University, and I graduated high school in 1977. So I went there. I was accepted. I really didn't want to go, but there was some pressure on me to go. So I did reluctantly, and I performed terribly academically. So much so that I left before they asked me to leave in after my second semester with an invitation to come back, which I never pursued. That's a whole nother thing. But while I was there, I met these guys. They're still around, even. I think they're still performing in some constellation of personages. I don't know who their members are now. But I met these guys. One guy, his name was Donald Miller. He was from Maryland, from some affluent part of Maryland. There was Donald Miller. There was Jose Abete. He was Cuban American from Long Island, somewhere in Long Island. There's Brian Dougherty. He was from Rhode Island. And there's a guy named Mark Abbott. Mark Abbott, I think, was from New Orleans. So I think I first met Donald Miller. He was the youngest one. I think he was a year older than me. I can't remember how I met him. I can't remember our first meeting, but it came to his attention that I played I still had a soprano saxophone then. So at some point he invited me to his room to play, or to one of those other guys' rooms. I think it was Dougherty. And these guys introduced me. They were my introduction to basically to the avant-garde, though I had already discovered the avant-garde in jazz by way of mainly by way of John Coltrane, because I was listening to a lot of jazz in the 70s. At the same time, I was with the R&B bands, the little basement bands that we played top 40. I was listening to a lot of rock by virtue of my older brother, who hung out with this what was still East Orange still had a fairly significant population of white people that lived mostly in the northern part of the city. And a lot of them went to the high school that I went to, ultimately, and that my brother went to. And so we hung out with this large kind of interracial crowd of kids, many of whom were like kind of hippie holdovers, They had a lot of the hippie aspects with them. But I was introduced to a broad spectrum of rock music by virtue of hanging out with my older brother, and when I was still in high school, right? And during that time, I did encounter some of the rock bands that that were more a little on the artier end, like David Bowie or Roxy Music or the Velvet Underground, which really were the progenitors of that whole art rock kind of scene. And so I came across them, but they were not nearly as popular among him and his circle, my brother's circle, as the more popular bands of the day, like Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd and the Rolling Stones and the Who. So, my education was heavy on those kinds of bands, you know what I mean? And there were a lot of them, and they were very good, you know. And the prog rock bands that later, like Yes and King Crimson, King Crimson came up later on at Columbia with Donald Miller and these other guys. So, but I did have some grounding in rock music. I was, I was, fairly well attenuated to rock music by the time I got to Columbia. But Donald Miller introduced me, brought my attention and a greater focus to the artier exponents of rock music, starting with the Velvet Underground. The Velvet Underground really were the foundation of a lot of the stuff that came later on in the United States and in England, where they were really taken maybe more seriously than they were here. So Donald Miller introduced me to, or brought my greater focus to those kinds of rock bands that were informed by other art forms and other artistic currents in the world of the visual arts and philosophy and literature and that kind of thing, which the Velvet Underground was noted for. Of course, they had that direct association with Andy Warhol and the whole pop art scene and all. But they also listened to avant-garde or modern 20th century classical music, and they also listened to jazz. Well, Donald Miller himself was more inclined toward the artier rock stuff and the jazz stuff. Brian Dougherty was he liked rock music too, the arty rock music, but not so much jazz so much. He was more into experimental European music, contemporary classical. Jose Abete from Long Island, he was more interested in pop music, but the artier stuff like Bowie and Roxy Music, and what was emerging, because this is 1977, so like the punk and the new wave stuff was at full steam by this point. So he didn't have any musical acumen per se, but he was into the arts and poetry and that kind of stuff, and into the socio-political implications of various art forms, including what was happening in music at the time, punk and new wave and this art stuff. And then there was Mark Abbott, who was, I'm sure he listened to a broad range of music, but he was also into electronic music, and he would make these little synthesizers, He would hand make them little circuits and circuitry and switches, and he would make his own synthesizers and use them. So, long story short, we formed a band our orbit was limited to the Columbia University campus. And we were known as Sick Dick and the Volkswagen. And
so it's just like experimental
very
music,
experimental, right? We would perform versions of rock songs like Iggy and the Stooges, Now I Want to Be Your Dog. And oh boy, I think we did Sweet Jane by the Velvet Underground. But the songs, they would start out as those songs, and they would very quickly disassemble to kind of free form noise, kind of free form, kind of like noise music. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
we weren't very
Well, and
popular.
Lou Reed, Velvet Underground, did a little bit of that kind of
Ye-
stuff where he would do kind of just sounds and
Yeah, like
that
cacophony.
in some of his music. Yeah,
They basically the musical cacophony, controlled cacophony. So,
yeah.
but but sometimes we would stick to like depending on the audience, sometimes we would maintain a solid 4/4 beat and just play all kinds of crazy stuff on top of it. So we weren't very popular. I think there was other bands on campus that played more conventional rock music that had much more in the way of a following. But we did get a mention in some article in Rolling Stone because the Columbia University is noted. It has a number of postgraduate schools, but it's most noted for its school of journalism, as
Oh,
opposed
okay.
as opposed to Harvard, which I think Harvard is most noted for what, law. I think Harvard is. I think Yale is most noted for maybe theater, maybe. Even though Yale has not top notch medical school and journalism school, but I think that's the general identification. Harvard law, Yale. I think Yale is theater, and Columbia journalism. I suspect that this guy, whoever was wrote for Rolling Stone, was probably an alumnus, right? Probably went back to Columbia to hang out, and probably heard us somewhere, you know. So we got a mention in a Rolling Stone article, Sick Dick and the Volkswagens. If I'm not mistaken, I think I came up with half of the name. I think Donald Miller came up with Sick Dick, and I came up with the Volkswagen, which was not based on any.
Well, actually, I looked it up. On YouTube, you have like 1,000 views.
Who does?
Sick Dick in the Volkswagen.
Really? There's somebody still operating as Sick Dick and the Volkswagen?
Yeah, there's somebody put your stuff up on.
Really?
You can look. I'll put a link in the description of this. But
Right? Because those
I
guys,
see
some of
that
the
it's posted in as certain things. Yeah,
really.
yeah. I guess somebody picked up there's people who do that. They pick up rare stuff and they post it. So
Wow, I had no idea. Is it
yeah,
on YouTube?
yeah, it's on YouTube. I mean, I don't think there'd be another group with that name with it.
Maybe, and I don't think so. Now those guys, some of those guys later on, Mark Abbott, Brian Dougherty, and Donald Miller, they formed this straight up, like not even free jazz, just straight up free music outfit called Borbetomagus, which is still around. I don't know how many of the original members are still in it. The last I heard some reference to them some months ago, suggesting that they're still around, but they're totally freeform, art music. Borbetomagus. It's a Borbetomagus. I'll spell it again. I'm going to look them up myself later.
But yeah, because did you have a song called "Flame Flows Down" or something like?
Not that I recall. Um, we
This
didn't
is
have.
from 1979 to 1981.
That's later.
Uh,
I was long gone by then.
oh, maybe did they continue after you left, or?
Not that I'm aware of. I thought
Hmm.
that they
Yeah, because
reformed.
I didn't think there'd be another band with that name, and it sounded like you described though, with like
Right.
synth and
Well,
yeah,
maybe we didn't copyright the name. Nobody bothered to do that, so the name is out there to be taken.
yeah,
I don't think anybody else in the band. I'm pretty sure nobody copyrighted that name.
yeah.
So
I just don't know who else would come up with that.
I don't
Yeah,
somebody that
yeah.
was somehow privy to it. Maybe it's a student there, somebody that saw us performing. We would perform in dorms.
No, it's the guys. It's the guys you mentioned. I see you mentioned Brian Dougherty, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, it says him in the band.
and who else?
Let me see who else. It's I just was looking at it.
This is
Yeah,
1979.
yeah, 1978 to 83. It says
83,
Mark
really?
Abbott, Brian Dougherty, William Hohauser, and Doug Snyder.
Right, now Doug Snyder, yeah, he popped up later on. Well, after I kind of left. I ran into
Oh, okay.
after I left Columbia voluntarily before they asked me to leave. I ran into Donald Miller. I ran into Donald Miller somewhere, and he told me about Borby Tomakas. I think that Snyder, I think he became a member of Borby Tomakas. I think after 1983 is when they formed that Borby Tomakas. And
Oh,
I
and they
think
had a bit of a following, or Borbert Jamaica.
a following. I think
Yeah,
they had a following they had a following in among that circle, people that like that kind of very way out music.
yeah. No Wave. It says
No,
it was called No Wave, right? Or
well, I guess they got lumped
that's
in
what they
with.
call.
They got lumped in with
Yeah,
because they didn't. That was the only place I guess they could fit. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Right. No Wave. Yeah, because No Wave was. Yeah, there would be some compatibility between what we were doing and the No Wave stuff, which was very experimental. Right. Right. And no wave is very what's the word? It did not really rise to the prominence of new wave and punk proper. Even though some of those bands became legendary, like Mars and
yeah.
DNA,
Or like Lydia Lunch came out of that too. I know she
Lydia
has kind
Lunch.
of a cult following.
Right, right,
Yeah,
right. That's right. Lydia Lunch. That's right. I forgot about her. Yeah. Wow, you're right. You really took me down the historical pathway there. Right. Wow, I had no idea that the Sick Dick and the Volkswagens continued on. I didn't know that.
yeah. Because I see the stuff uploaded to YouTube. I guess it
Really?
had like a cult following, or like people had the vinyl or
Really?
something. Yeah,
I wonder if there's
yeah.
any performance video. I mean, I'm going to look it up later myself, but
Sure, yeah. But you heard of Death, like, because that was like a pre-punk band
that.
or
Oh yeah, I
influential
forgot
punk
about
band.
that. Right, and
Yeah, they came out of Detroit, and that they were all African American,
right, they were
but they
black.
were
Yeah, I
like one of
forgot
the more
about them.
yeah,
Right, they were right.
yeah,
They were straddling the map in many ways because even though they were straddling the map culturally just by virtue of being African American, their music was not embraced by African Americans. You know what I mean? By and large, African Americans just thought that was crazy white boy music. You know, and the way a lot of African Americans thought Jimi Hendrix. A lot of African Americans didn't dig Jimi Hendrix, man. A lot of
really.
African Americans they thought that was crazy white boy music. You know, but there were some, of course, that did, like me and my friends. There was some that did, and like George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic was very Hendrix driven. You know, with George Clinton's unique sensibility and sense of humor. You know, but yeah, Death. Yeah, they're a good band. Man, they didn't get anywhere. Even when the people that wanted to promote them, that wanted to like, and usually not in black music circles and rock music circles, and they're mostly white artists. But they did have people that were willing to promote them, but they told the leader, you got to drop that name. He said it's like an albatross, and he would not. He would not. He would not
Yeah,
drop
he was stubborn about it. Yeah,
it.
yeah.
He would not do it. Yeah, so there's a documentary about them, which is pretty informative. I saw it once.
Yeah, on Netflix. I think it was because like somebody found their demo years. That's what made me think of that, because I saw like the
Right,
Slick Dick, and it was on YouTube. Like, I think years later somebody found their old demo, and then they started gaining a following like years later.
right,
Like, not like a huge following, but like they have the Netflix series and all that.
right. And you can still buy their records. I think they can. You can still throw them some money. I think if there's a way to get some money to them, you know, you buy their stuff or download it or what have you. So their legacy is out there. They become known. They're still largely obscure to most people, including most African Americans. Most African Americans
Yeah,
would not have come across them and would
yeah.
probably.
Well, even Bad Brains is more known, I
Bad
guess. Like
Brains is
Bad
one,
Brains.
right? Bad Brains,
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I forgot about them. Yeah, I found out about them in the '80s. They're one of my favorites. I went to see them a couple of times, but I didn't see them with the original singer. Was RJR? What was his name? He had an initial name
I
like that.
forget. Yeah,
But I
but
saw him.
they mix like reggae influence, and because I
Right,
know that there was also I think that at one point there was a lot of there was like a connection with like reggae and punk, like the reggae fans and like the punk fans are like
Oh,
Because I think like
definitely.
the guy from the Clash, he
Right.
was like he did music with like reggae
That was
artists or
that was
yeah
mostly true in England, where they had a
yeah
large, England had a large West Indian Jamaican population for decades, and the British youth and British youth culture, rubbed up against the Jamaican youth culture, you know, in a more intimate way than white American youth had access to reggae culture here. We did, but not the way they did there. It was much more interactive, you know, on the face to face basis. You know what I mean? So, right. I mean, there are a lot of American bands, adopted it, but not so many. And the English are always better at it, you know. With, I guess, Bad Brains being an exception because they're American, but they're African Americans, you know, who probably they immerse themselves in that music, probably when they were kids, But there are plenty of white kids in now by now in the United States. I think the gap between the English kids and the American kids that are that like reggae and are oriented to include it in their music has narrowed significantly. You know, there are a lot of American bands. In fact, I'm trying to think of one. They were kind of popular in the '90s, and they used like a reggae feel. Boy, I'm not going to think of their name. 311 or there are a couple.
maybe 311 yeah. Sublime or no
They're one of those kind of bands, right? Sublime,
yeah
right? So, and they had a good take on it, the way they incorporated it into their music.
yeah
Wow.
and I guess that relates to one of like the main points. Like what I guess in your experience, in what ways have you seen like music be like a unifier in a way to kind of break down barriers and I
Well,
guess as a universal language?
we just mentioned one, which was in England, where there was enough racial antagonism in England between, and usually like working class white English and their various ethnic groups, you know, largely exemplified by British West Indians and large populations of Indians and Pakistanis and Arabs, especially Arabs whose countries were part of the former British Empire. So you had that element there. Reggae was a unifying force amongst the youth there, who in many cases were at odds in very violent ways. Their youth culture, gang culture, and stuff. And you had a similar thing here when Blondie recorded that Rapture. That kind of, there may have been some connective continuity between hip hop and rap music and like a new wave before then. But I can't think of any. That record kind of unified the hip hop and post punk new wave culture in many ways here in the United States, and I know that had to result in some greater cultural interplay between those two populations, because you would hear that Blondie song in black club, you know what I mean, and you would
What
hear,
did she like mix? I don't think I've listened. Did she mix like hip hop influence into it, or
oh
what
yeah,
did she?
it's a rap tune. Fat Five Freddy, no, she raps in it. You know what I mean? And it's got like
Oh,
a funky kind of rhythmic, like
oh,
undertone with horns, even. And she refers to Fab Five Freddy, who was like a major architect of hip hop culture, uh, who did not make records, I don't think, or maybe he did, but he was kind of a chronicler, for lack of a better word. He's always at all the parties, at all the events, Fab Five Freddy.
yeah.
But I don't know what he did. Maybe he was a journalist. Maybe he wrote for some fanzines or something like that. But he was just always on the scene. He was definitely like a prime mover. But that record definitely spoke to a relationship between rap music and and like the new wave culture. And after a while, you began to see you did begin to after, by the late 70s, you began to see more like hip hop, like graffiti art downtown. You started to see it more on like the walls of abandoned buildings down in the East Village. You know.
And I guess even maybe I know some people would say it was appropriation or whatever, but like even like some of the white like hip hop artists that came in and like maybe that kind of uh I guess like Beastie Boys or like some of the, I'm trying to think of like
Oh
the
yeah,
other one, but like
yeah. Well,
different
yeah.
white
Well,
art. Yeah,
mainly them. They, I mean, they were the first.
yeah.
They were the first. It made white guy exponents of rap music to achieve some major visibility, and they were good at it. And yeah, I think they maybe the first, really the really first ones.
And they started as a punk band and they
And
evolved
they
from that
started
Beastie
as
Boys
a
start.
hard, right. So there again, there
Yeah.
it is. There's the parody, right? There's a relationship. Actually, I guess they are a better example than that Blondie record. The Blondie record is a good example, but they are an even better example because they've shifted, they shifted genres, right? Right. So yeah, no, I'm glad you thought of them. I would have thought of them much later. I hate that. You know, I said, damn it, I forgot the Beastie Boys. I can't think of any other example in the New York area, at least that didn't that did not come later. They didn't have many peers in the '80s. These other bands came later on, like the ones you mentioned, whose names I've forgotten already. Um, yeah, so yeah, certain artists.
Maybe like in the '60s, I guess, was there a little bit of a like a unity epic because like the civil rights movement and like the music that was going on there.
Well,
What were you-
you had Jimi Hendrix, but I think a band that spoke more to kind of the unified interests of young people, because it was a youth culture, black and white, would have been maybe Sly and the Family Stone. Because they were very funky. Their music was very funky and very black, but they were an interracial band. They had a white drummer and a horn man, and they were both very good musicians. So they exemplified it, right? And they had a crossover appeal. They would be invited to like festivals where most of the other artists were largely white. Even though some of those festivals would invite like early rock and rollers, they would invite people like Little Richard or Fats Domino. You know what I mean? But most of the other artists would be contemporary white rock bands with no black equivalents. Most of the black artists would be the older first generation rock and rollers that would be invited by, in order to pay the respect, you know what I mean? And help them make some money, especially in England. You know, they was a lot of those, and even the old bluesmen and early rock and roll musicians got like a new lease on life in the UK by virtue of bands like the Rolling Stones and the Who and the Beatles that promoted them, and like hooked them up, with venues and promoters and everything. But yes, I think the answer to your question is yes. We do have examples of how these genres, which emerged from different cultural milieus, that's my word of the day, milieu. On the one hand, South Bronx and Upper Harlem and Inglewood, New Jersey, and on the other hand, the Lower East Side, and Manhattan at large, did have these like kind of unifying elements. Number one, I guess the first one is the DIY thing is the first thing, and then you have these little linkages like the Beastie Boys, their evolution, and a record like that Blondie's Tunes, whose title I can't remember now. Rapture, like Rapture. Yeah, that song did did have a significant impact. I think the connection between hip hop music and like the new wave thing were already in formation, and I think mainly through the graffiti art. I think a lot of white kids downtown were doing graffiti art. White kids that might otherwise, and who probably were listening to hip hop music, but were also listening to those bands, following those bands during their early days, because that was what was happening in their neighborhood. I would imagine at some point some of those black kids from Harlem went downtown. If they're anything like me, and I'm not that unique. So some of those black kids were going downtown to CBGB's. If this black kid from New Jersey was, then I know they were. You
Yeah,
know what I mean? I'm
because
not
I
my,
guess it's just curiosity to see what
right,
was there, right? Like,
right.
yeah,
I'm not the only one who had similar interests, who had fairly broad ranging tastes. And I introduced a lot of my friends to white, quote unquote, white rock and what have you.
yeah.
But I know I'm not that
Well,
unique.
I think that just comes with being like an artist too, or like a musician. Is like you're usually you're interested in like what other people are doing
Right,
too,
right.
like what others. Yeah,
Right. Most of my friends, aside from the friends that were in the little R&B and top 40 band, I had other friends who did not have who were not musicians, who were not musically inclined personally. But they love music, and they were eager students in my case to like the stuff I would introduce them to. And they took the mantle and ran with it. They still listen to largely black music, but they were white artists that whose records they would buy, by virtue of my introduction. So I did my own part in kind of like you know profligating this kind of interchange. Because it happened to me. I was a model of it. I was subject to it, and I became a model of it. So yeah,
but I guess any final thoughts you want to say before we wrap up, or
no, I can't think of any overarching concluding thought. Other than that, for better or worse, this hybridization does continue, and in some ways that are kind of remarkable to me, because I did watch last year. I watched the Country Music Awards. I was surprised at the number of young African American country musicians that were there and that were being celebrated and that were up for awards I never heard of. And one of them was an interracial couple, young, black guy and white girl, you know, and they were up for an award in a genre which a lot of people maybe unfairly, at least based on the model of country music that I was exposed to during my formative years in the 1970s, when it was still Conway Twitty, the earlier model, before, because country music has been rebooted, you know, to be more consonant with contemporary musical idiom. And so there's a lot of pop music and a lot of the new country music that you're hearing now.
yeah,
A lot of
like the
pop and
CMT kind of
right,
stuff. Yeah,
right. A lot of pop music. And in one
yeah.
of these country bands,
I like the only country I like is like Steve Earle, or like maybe Johnny Cash. But
and then Johnny Cash goes back to the rootsy stuff. Right. But
yeah,
I'm talking the newer bands and I don't follow them, but Antebellum, um, not even the Dixie Chicks who who were forced to drop Dixie. So now they're just the Chicks. To me, that is one example of like overextended. What's the word? Damn it! It's correctness, but that's not the word. There's another phrase that has kind of eclipsed that. Wokeness. That's an overextension of wokeness. That they were compelled to drop Dixie. I'm black. The word never fucked with me. You know what I mean? Yeah, I didn't have a problem with it. What the fuck? Come
yeah,
on. That's
yeah,
quibbling. That's quibbling.
yeah.
They were fucking
Is that your reaction to a lot of things that
over,
people find offensive nowadays? Or
overreaching, apologetic, guilty liberalism, liberalistic impulses. You know what I mean? Which to me almost speak to some kind of Like, what do you feel guilty about? What did you do? What did you do that you
Yeah.
feel? You know what I mean?
Well, in a way, some of that makes it harder to like interact more naturally because it's like then people are walking on eggshells. Like,
It
oh, am
makes
I going
them
to say this?
self-conscious, right? The eggshell walk,
Yeah.
right? That's one of the probably unintended consequences of I don't know, overextended, maybe just too emphatic liberalism. You know what I mean? Or misdirected. You know what I mean? To me, that's quibbling to make them drop the word Dixie from their title. Now, who's that helping? You know what I mean? Who's that helping?
Yeah. So
And
like it never like a lot of these things I guess they say are offensive. Like you didn't think of it that way.
no, and I think most black people were oblivious to them anyway. Most black people, young black people, were oblivious to that even there was a Dixie
Yeah,
church.
I didn't even know what the Dixie meant something
Right.
or not. I didn't even know.
Well, Dixie
Yeah.
means the South, the American South, way down Dixie, you know. But that connection is lost on a lot of people, even white people like yourself, and a lot of young black people are not aware of the connection. And if they were, they would not give a hoot. Would not be offended by because there was a band with the word Dixie in their name. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
whatever. But well, in conclusion, I just look forward to seeing how these various musical idioms that might be identified with their source of origin, might be identified with a particular ethnic or socio-economic ethnic group, but how these things kind of make their way into other areas. Oh, and yes, so I was surprised that to find like the Country Music Award, here were these, and whatever you're feeling about country music today, because I know some country, I don't know if they're purists, but fans of country music, country music that was exemplified during previous decades, they don't like the new stuff at all. They don't even consider it to be country. But I did find it interesting in terms of like whatever racial elements or racist elements that might be attributed to it. I found it very surprising the number of country artists that were up for awards, and that there was this one interracial couple that nobody was antagonizing, and and even Megan the Stallion made an appearance to present an award. Megan the Stallion is very current hip hop. You know, are you familiar with her?
Not too much.
No.
No.
Well,
She was at the.
she was at the Country Music Awards, and she's giving out an award. She is very au courant in the hip hop world. She's closely associated with Cardi B. I think they have the same
Oh, okay.
production team or management team or something. She's a black chick. She's very scantily clad, big bodacious body, big tits and ass. You know what I mean? Heavily made up. And there she was at the country music. I said, what the fuck is she doing there? So, for what it's worth, and some might think it's not worth much based on their assessment of what country music and what rap music is today. Based on that assessment, they might not think much of it. But I think it is important that she was there, and that all those black artists were there and being celebrated and receiving awards, and among them an interracial couple. And one of those bands had a DJ. One of those country bands had a turntable, right? So there
Yeah.
we go. Whatever you think about the end result, the product, it exemplifies a kind of a fusion, right? Of
Yeah.
an integration in a very literal sense. I don't think that in and of itself is not a bad thing. What you think of how country music and hip hop is being represented today, that's a separate issue, right? The quality
But it's
thereof.
it's good at least those barriers are coming
Right.
down, even if it is with making shitty music,
Even if it
and
is shit.
sometimes it's making good music.
So there you go. So that's my
Yeah.
conclusion.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for coming on and having
Yeah,
this chat. Hopefully, this was insightful for the listeners. I know I learned a
I hope
lot.
so. I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so. And then, it sparked reminiscences and insights that I forgot I had. You know, so it was good for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you got to share them with us and the audience. So
Yes,
yeah.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Yeah, and
All right. Well,
if somebody is edified in any way by what we shared, then all the better. You know, and there's a lot.
that about does.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. I was going to say, and
But
There's a lot we overlooked that maybe we can get to some other time.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, sure. Could always get to it in part 2 or
Yeah.
whatever.
Right.
But that's about it for this episode. And let's talk about the deep stuff. If you want to keep updated, I'm on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, show social media. Let's talk about the deep stuff. And that's about it for this episode. We'll
Yeah.
catch you on the next one.